Well, hello everybody, welcome to another video, kind of a third in a trilogy, or actually I guess quadrilogy, of videos I'm doing covering the announcement of mini X-Packs. So, at first we just kind of covered the news in general, that Guild Wars 2 isn't doing expansions and Living World like we knew before. It's all expansions now, with just some patches afterwards. They're going to come out regularly, slightly cheaper. Then I did a video where we looked at the elite specialization situation, because the blog post didn't mention them, kind of had this cagey mention of different combat mechanics or something, and I kind of illustrated, hey, can they get away with not doing elite specs? What would some potential alternatives be? Then we looked at lore and story. That was over this weekend. All the different places that we might actually be able to go, and loose threads now that the Elder Dragons are over, and now that we have this kind of clear concept that it's only going to be X amount of story, it's going to be 3 maps. And I actually found that was a really cool video, because it made me realize that they're actually kind of liberated by the smaller expansion size. Doing disconnected stories actually allows them a lot of room to pick up a ton of threads, and I did 14 concepts in that video, which I just kind of waffled through while I was in bed on my laptop that night. I feel like they could do even more, so that was really quite cool. Now here's the last thing. Features. Big ticket ideas that change the game in some way. If you imagine, you know, a new expansion announcement's come out, what do you get with that expansion? Well, you're expecting some bullet points of some things to shake stuff up, right? I do believe people buy expansions for features, and these mini ones are going to be no different. There should be something there. Now, there's a little bit of an unfair thing going on with Guild Wars at the moment, which is that the first ever expansion, Heart of Thorns, did loads of features and kind of gave this sense that all the expansions would. Then we had like this really rich and detailed thing with mounts. When End of Dragons came out, you know, there's less things that they could do. There were some outstanding big ticket ideas from MMOs, like fishing is the big one, I think, really. But some of the features they announced for End of Dragons were kind of duds, and people were saying, well, they should have done better, could have done better. I sort of do think we have to stop on this topic for this video and take stock of the fact that the game's 10 years old. It generally has all the major things most MMOs have now. At some point, they don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. Maybe at some point, it is right for us to entertain the idea that an expansion is literally just more story, more exploration, more content. And if that really rips people up and makes them feel sour and like they're not really going to like the game for that, then I think at a certain point you do just have to ask yourself, do you like Guild Wars 2? Because the game is not going to change too much the more that time goes by, and you're either looking for new content or you're not. So I do kind of have that in mind, but nonetheless, there are still some big ideas that I really want to see for this game that I do believe mini X-Packs should sell, and that's kind of what I'm going to go through here. I think that doing it mini is actually really liberating for them, because they can just focus on one big feature each time instead of too many. Like skiffs and the turtle and stuff, maybe they felt like duds because they weren't all in on that idea. You know, when we go back to Heart of Thorns, it was really crazy, guys. They did the mastery system, and with gliding as a big part of it, and guild halls, and raids, and adventures in the open world maps, and like in the other formats, you had like the stronghold map, and a lot of these ended up feeling like duds or took a long time to really get to a good place or have been abandoned. You know, we don't really see much with adventures lately, do we? So, no, specifically not in the Heart of Thorns style. So I don't think that we're going to see expansions like Heart of Thorns, or even say with End of Dragons. I think they should have, here's a mini X-Pack, here's the big idea. So what could those big ideas be? Let's look at these headline features. I'll go through what I think are realistic and I would actually like. And some of these are really cool, but require quite a lot of conversation. So let's start with something easy here and just underline the idea of mounts. I do think mounts are viable for mini X-Packs. End of Dragons actually kind of did demonstrate quite well how this works. End of Dragon's big thing was the turtle, yes, but also it gave us some of the older mounts too. Like if you'd missed POF, it also had the raptor with it, for example, and some of those early mounts, which are now kind of like, you can think of core expansion mounts, and then you look at stuff like the griffin as POF specific mounts. I think we could see something similar with these other mini X-Packs. You get a handful of like base mounts with them, but there is a new cool special mount associated with the X-Pack. For this one, it's been the turtle. If you watched, I did another video talking about the next patch coming up next week. I actually don't think the turtle's been that good just yet. I think they really need to work on it for the upcoming stuff. So the turtle was a bit of a dud. That doesn't mean that future mounts might not be. I think there are some niches. You might say, well, WP, Jesus Christ, we've already got flying mounts, and we've got fast mounts, and we've got slow mounts, and we've got the skimmer for the water stuff with a skiff on top, which really kind of doesn't fit. What the hell else could they do? So here's the mounts I think are still possible. A fast multiplayer mount. So the turtle right now, it has the side seat, but it's very slow, it's very cumbersome. Imagine something a bit more like a beetle with a side seat. I'm not going to give you guys the actual theme, because that would depend on the story of the X-Pack and all that kind of stuff. But a fast multiplayer mount, I think there is a gameplay niche for that. I also think there's potentially a gameplay niche for a flying multiplayer mount. So those are those two big things. I would consider the skiff to be the, the multiplayer water-based thing. But going back to water, I actually do think there's some other concepts there as well. And it's not that this has to come in with a story with a ton of water content necessarily. But right now we can swim down on our skimmer, but again, it's not very fast. And we can go down on the turtle, and it's very slow. So again, on the idea of speed, a fast underwater mount. Like, I've always imagined a dolphin that you can like have this burst, a bit like the beetle burst, but you're like charging around. The beetle of underwater, some kind of mechanic where they could go into slipstreams, stuff like that. I think that would be a viable mount and an interesting mount. Staying underwater, I suppose if you're going to actually get an underwater expansion where you go really, really deep, you could have a diving or ascending mount, so like you can go up and down really quickly. I'm not quite sure what that would look like a jellyfish or something that can... I don't know, really. But maybe that's an idea. And, if they really push with the mastery system, they can do stuff like where there's really high pressure, low down. You take constant damage if you're too low, unless you're on a certain mount. They can do things like that if they really want to try and carve out a space for it. And finally, there's this idea of combat mounts. The turtle is kind of... all mounts to a certain extent have a bit of combat, right? The skill 1, you disengage with it and you do some damage. The turtle kind of pushed that envelope by saying, okay, you can actually stay on the mount and keep doing damage by sieging, or like by constantly spamming the CC auto attack if you're the driver. Combat mounts are a very interesting idea, and I think they don't necessarily fit into the game very well right now, but with a lot of careful planning and good design, I think that could be an interesting choice as well. So there you go, that's mounts. I could totally imagine mini X-Packs giving you a mount, maybe 2, and people would be reasonably excited by that. It would run out fairly soon after that, but there are some spaces. Right, let's get into something really cool and really big. This is something people have been talking about for years. I actually wasn't a huge fan of it for years, but I'm a huge fan of it now because of its possibility for the future. Let's talk about housing. Oh, yes. So, I think housing is a good idea. I thought once upon a time that Guildhall decorations and stuff would be a worthy substitute, but they're clearly not. People don't get their own personal ownership. There's a lot of like weird mechanical issues. You have to be in the right community with the right Guildhall that spent the right amount of money. There are economical issues with it. There were implementation issues with it. It's not a worthy substitute. When you look at big features from the perspective of, oh, what do other MMOs have and Guild Wars doesn't, like fishing is a good example of this, it makes sense to do housing as well. When I think way back to Living World Season 1, when NCSoft West were releasing another big MMO in the West, WildStar, WildStar's big thing was housing, and I wasn't really too into it back then, but looking back, I can see the power of it, and I definitely would like to play with something like this. But I think the real value here is how, if they were smart, ArenaNet has a tendency to be a bit all or nothing, to go too much too fast. But if they're smart, they can implement something here that's heavily expandable and keeps paying off over loads of mini X-Packs. And that's the real thing. In a lot of my videos lately, I've been talking about, oh, what could we get in a mini X-Pack? But the idea is there's going to be another one, and then another one, and another one. So you want to think long-term about this. And this is where I think housing's very, very good. Think about how POF introduced the idea of mounts, and End of Dragons added a new one, and other mini X-Packs might add other ones. So housing could be the same. Essentially, when housing first comes in on the first mini X-Pack that does it, I would say it's a fairly basic system. It's a lot like Guildhall decorating, but it's for individuals in their own instances. I would say you'd update the Guildhall decorating system just a little bit so that, what's clunky with the ground targeting or opening the palette to get different tools and things can be smoothed out. A little bit of a rework, but you basically just slap that idea into people's own personal plots of land and instances. So you would enable it, first of all, I think, straight away on home instances. Every race has their own home instance. I think that could definitely be a candidate for your house if you want it to be. And you should be able to decorate and you should be able to build in there. But also, the system would give you some new additional plots elsewhere in the world. So, there'd be some plots that you can pick out in the new maps environments, or maybe even in the other expansions if they really wanted to, if they wanted to cross-pollinate. If you want to go live in the Maguma jungle, maybe they should add a plot that you can go and decorate there. And they'd just be instances that you can take your friends into. Maybe there can be nodes and stuff that you do there daily. Maybe there can be an idea for getting friends together to actually visit. But none of that stuff's necessary. Just the basic idea is give people their own decorations and their own decorating capacity for instances, their plots of land that they pick. That's it. And I think that's a very realistic thing that the game could add. The reality is that they probably dump it onto a mastery line, because I think they're going to be desperate to find interesting masteries as we go forwards. A bit like how fishing didn't need to be a mastery, but they made it a mastery. I think this would be a mastery, but what I think is most important about my idealized version of housing is it would actually be a discipline. So remember when Heart of Thorns came out and it added the scribe? Obviously nowadays, in retrospect, the scribe isn't something people really like very much because a lot of the guild features weren't implemented that well, and so on and so on and so on. But it is actually quite an exciting, captivating thing to see. If you imagine on a bullet pointed list, oh, there's a whole new crafting discipline coming in. This is something we see other MMOs do quite often too. And I think if they were going to do housing, they would add a discipline for it. Like how Guildhall decorators have scribes, we'd get a new one. We wouldn't just expand scribe. They should do a totally new one and call it, you know, like the decorator or the builder or whatever that they like. That discipline means that when the X-Pack comes out, people get this new progression. They might not be adding new classes, they might not be adding elite specs or any of that stuff, but at least there's a discipline for people to like level up and go through, for those who are so inclined. Obviously this isn't a combat feature, I'm not pretending it is. But I think you do a new discipline, and with a whole new discipline, that means you craft your own items, you escape from like the scribe economies, and just how messy everything was with scribing. Scribing itself thematically was really over-engineered as far as I'm concerned. Like, I don't like this idea of we make blueprints to throw into a magical 3D printer. You know, don't do any of that. Let's just have decorators building stuff out of timber and lumber and whatever they like to actually build their houses. Like, let's just do it that way. And so now you've got huge amounts of items and economy that's been stimulated again, which hasn't been, and has kind of been duds for years in the game. Lots of new training and interesting and fun things for people to do. And just loads of new items that you can get. Items for doing heart quests, you know, which help you with your decorating. Items for beating strike missions. Items in the new fractals. Items, there's all kinds of stuff that can really pump up the game with this. And there can be prestige rewards as well, just like how with guild halls, you know, you got the trophies and stuff. Again, all the implementation was a bit wonky, but they can do that. And I think that they can look at what they did with scribing in guild halls as well, and use those lessons to inform a much better system for housing here. But I think the key to success with housing, okay, housing in mini X-Packs, is on that first release, they should keep it really narrow and quite simple what you can actually do. Like, the core concepts here are what? Building walls, doors, windows, roofs, making our rooms, decorating them a little bit, stuff like that. But actually, build your house, create it. That's the extent of it, though, okay? That for, like, the first original release. Now, let's talk about subsequent mini X-Packs. This is where it really starts to shine, because you can treat Guild Wars 2 a bit like The Sims, right? With all of their DLCs, if you will. So the original housing feature, think of that now as like the Path of Fire Raptor, right? That's going to come over in every single X-Pack now. No matter what mini X-Pack you buy, you will get that original discipline and you will get the base access to the feature. But now each expansion has its own little spin on it. So the next mini X-Pack gives you the Gardener discipline. And the Gardener has a whole new level of progression for you to go through. Even more different items and things to get. But this guy specializes in all about the stuff around your house. You can now make picket fences, and you can plant flowers, and you can create lawns and gravel paths and whatever else you like on this new dimension to the house. Don't do it all in the first mini X-Pack. Do like a gardening thing in the next one. The next expansion has like the Tamer discipline. And the Tamer, again, is new progression, blah, blah, blah. But now what you can do is add pets to your house. You can get living creatures, and, you know, you can have pets indoors, and you can have bigger creatures out in your gardens if you have those, and so on and so on. We expand it. Next expansion has like, you know, aquascaping or whatever. You can make ponds and rivers and fountains and indoor hot tubs and pools and all that kind of stuff. The next expansion has like a heavy contractor, so you can add attic spaces and cellars and dungeons beneath the house, and on and on and on. You know, I even like the idea of maybe something where you can add NPCs to your home who will live there with you, and maybe they can even be iconic story heroes and stuff. This is how housing can keep paying off for like the next 10 years of Guild Wars 2 over lots of mini X-Packs. It's like infrastructure that they keep expanding outwards. So that's why I like it most. You know, ArenaNet if they do want to do something like that, they have to think quite carefully about how the game engine will work and how they want to expand it. Like that idea of adding basements and cellars and stuff, they would have to have that in mind when they very initially create housing so that it's ready and expandable. But as long as they do think ahead, and I think this has been one of the big things with Guild Wars for a long time, they don't think ahead enough. If they do that, this could be a really, really cool thing I'd be happy to see as a part of expansion. And by the way, not just expansions would benefit from this. Think about like every quarterly patch. You could get new house plots coming into the game. Festivals right now, they all add guild hall decorations, but how many of us really care? You know, only the nerdiest of us, the most like dedicated of us, really care a huge amount about the guild hall decorations. Well, if those become home decorations, yeah, suddenly each year's festival and those little minor updates, people pay a lot more attention to. So there you have it. Housing. Let's go on to another feature. I've rambled about that one long enough. I do want to talk a little bit about legendaries. So I'm actually going to talk about legendaries twice in this video. But right now, when I'm talking about legendaries, what I mean is I don't really care about legendary weapons. But what I mean is legendaries in like whole new slots, into entirely new ideas of legendaries. So, first of all, I think this would be totally cool in a mini X pack, legendary mount. I would still love to get a legendary mount. A mount I can actually earn and work on in-game through collections, through resource acquiring, and it's a big, cool reward at the end. I love the idea of a legendary mount. If they do legendary mounts, well then, what's the legendary raptor gonna look like? What's the legendary skimmer gonna look like? What's the legendary springer? They don't all have to come in at once, but each mini X-Pack can do a new one, for example. I think this is a really good idea. The tricky issue with legendary mounts is, unfortunately, the gem store, because the gem store went so mental with the visuals on mounts and so crazy with them. I'm not actually sure how a legendary mount can compete with a 2000 gem mount. So like when you've got a mount in the gem store that is a totally new animal and it has footsteps and it has a trail effect and it's got a crazy on mount activation explosion of pretty effects, you know, they went crazy with the mounts. That's already in game. That's already in the gem store. What the hell can a legendary be? Now, I really don't have any great ideas for that, since they've already done footprints and stuff like that. If Arena can figure something out, I think this could be very, very good. They figured something out for the Gen 3 weapons, after all, you know, the on-kill explosion effect, so maybe there's something there. There is also the argument, well, maybe they don't need to do better than the gem skins. Maybe just the fact that this is a mount not on a gem store is enticing to people, but I'm not sure I fully buy that. I think that might be a little bit dodgy. So, but it's a good idea if they can figure something out, and I hate coming here with a video that I don't even really have the full answer, so maybe you guys in the comments can drop something there. Talking about other legendaries, though, I'm not interested in weapons anymore. However, armor, we only ever had legendary armor once. I must admit, I'm quite excited about the idea of Gen 2 armor. It doesn't have to be tied to raids or strikes or whatever, not necessarily. It might still be a good idea. It doesn't necessarily have to be just a PvE set either, because I think that caused some issues before. But a new set of legendary armor that looks really flashy, really cool. This could be good. Now, I think ArenaNet have been a bit leery and afraid of this idea because it took a long time for them to implement and figure out the Gen 2 armor. And when they did, it was a bit controversial. Not everyone liked the aesthetic. You know, I think back in particular to the whole thing with the medium legendary armor, where people were like, yay, it's not a trench coat, and then when you unsheath it becomes a trench coat in what almost looked like a bit of a joke. I think that because that patch was a little controversial, dare I say, that might be too strong of a term, but it was a bit of a wobbly patch and they spent a lot of time on it. If they do Gen 2 legendary armor, they're running that exact same risk again, it might look like. There might also be something here about how it competes with outfit sales or something, I don't know. But if the idea is it's risky because people might not like the specific visuals, well, the more sets of legendary armor come in, eventually you're going to hit a visual that people enjoy, you know. All they have to do is make the Gen 2 sets look very different from the Gen 1 sets, and they're likely now to appeal to audience members that felt unsatisfied the first time, you know. So I do think that this is a really good idea, and I would love to log into a Guild Wars where I get to work on legendary armor again. That would be awesome. Now, two little side notes. First, you've got back pieces. I do see space for back pieces, but I'm going to come to that again in a minute in a different part of this video. And then finally, there's the idea of the aqua breather. Now, look, this is basically the last slot in the game. We don't have a legendary aqua breather. You can't get it. So I think it would be nice to be in Guild Wars. I would like to finally finish, you know, my last item and make that legendary. But let's be real, is this actually an expansion selling thing? No. I think they should do it, but they should hide it. You know, if they're going to do a big underwater themed expansion like the Kraken or whatever, I would hide this a bit like the Griffin was hidden at the end of POF. It'll be big and it'll be special and it'll be cool and it will take effort to get, but it's not something anyone knows about until they stumble on it after they've beaten the story or something. I think that's the best way to do the aqua breather. I don't really have anything else to say about it, to be honest. It's more of a novelty for very dedicated players, let's be real. Speaking of features that I'm not too keen on, with the Aqua Breather there, here's another big one. Now, I mentioned in the Discords just the other day, I said, guys, I'm thinking of this video where I want to do all these different features for mini X packs, but I'm kind of drawing a blank. And one of the responses I got from you guys was an old outstanding feature, Polymock. So, Polymock was a thing. If you guys are out of the loop on this, way back in the day in Eye of the North, this was a Guild Wars 1 expansion that was supposed to be basically hinting at all the things that would come in with the sequel game. And one of the big things Eye of the North did was it introduced this game played by the Asura called Polymock, where it's essentially like tonic battles. You assume the visage of a monster, and it's monster v monster. I believe there was a quote a long time ago that Polymock was kind of like Pokemon in Guild Wars. And clearly this was something they wanted to do for the sequel game. There's an unused Polymock arena in Ratassoum that has been there for 10 years and hasn't been touched. So that's an obvious thing to say, well, let's do Polymock in one of these mini X-Packs. And I do think finally, actually, with a mini X-Pack, Polymock is exactly the kind of thing that would be in scope. This could be the feature. But I don't actually really know how keen I am on this. I think there's much better things the game can keep doing. I would take even some of those more obscure mounts, I think, than Polymock. It's one of those weird things where it's like, would this really be a benefit to the game, or is it just something we're talking about because it seems to be an outstanding issue, you know? And it's kind of difficult to disentangle those two ideas sometimes. The most excited I'd be for Polymock is if it came in as a mini pet system, like it's a mini pet battler. Different mini pets have different capabilities, and obviously in other MMOs we see they use their minis for, you know, mini battle games like this. But this is always going to be a bit of a side novelty. I'm a bit worried it would end up like Costume Brawl or Belcher's Bluff, something that ostensibly people can do while they're waiting around for metas, but they don't in the end because, you know, the system wasn't thought through well enough or whatever. I don't know. If they spend a whole mini X-Pack purely thinking about Polymock as the big feature, maybe they can engineer something really cool. And maybe having a feature like that people can participate in while waiting for, you know, their raid boss pull or waiting for you know, their strike mission, or particularly the meta events. Maybe that's really good, but it's a lower priority for me, I must be honest, but I'll mention it here in the video. And finally, the last big feature, this I would put alongside housing, is actually genuinely really good and something to sit up and pay attention to, is playable races. Yeah, you could probably guess I was going to say this in this video. Now look, I have done countless hours and hours, countless videos, countless streams, countless discussions on the viability of new playable races, about the voice acting stuff, about the armor stuff, about leveling, about whether it matters because does it affect combat or not, and everything about it. We've talked unendingly about it. I'm not going to do it in this video, but I will just restate once again, I am of the opinion there are viable ways of doing new playable races. They would be incredibly exciting. The best thing about this as a concept is it is a signal to people outside of the game, people who are not currently fans of Guild Wars 2, that, hey, there's a new thing you can level and play, a bunch of noobs are joining. It's a bit like the Steam release, right? And getting fresh blood into the game and growing the game is, like, priority number one. I think that this is an excellent feature. It appeals to many vets, not all vets, but many vets, and it's very, very good for new players. And they got some great concepts as well. A lot like housing, it's something you can keep giving. Once that first mini X-Pack comes out that sort of sets the precedent and exactly how it can be done and will be done, then new mini X-Packs can add new races, you know? I think Tengu would be the first I would want to see. I really want to play as Tengu. Kodan after that, Lagos maybe, there's a bit of an issue with the wings, and then they can go on to wackier or weirder concepts just based on, you know, how things have been going. I know there are people out there that say, oh, you could get playable Quaggan. You know, when we get to very, very weird body proportions and sizes and stuff, I start to get a bit iffy about it. But, you know, there's also nothing wrong with them writing new lore that has new races for us to play that are in that humanoid space, can use a bunch of the old armor. I think there is unending potential here. I think there's even potential for new categories of the existing races. So, like, for example, we have the Asura right now. If they did an expansion where we go back to the depths and we find other Asura there, ancient Asura cities that survived Primordus and managed to live down there, these Asura might look very different. They might look a lot more like the Guild Wars 1 Asura, very different proportions, but they are essentially still Asura. Well, that's like a new playable race, a new type of Asura that you can play. I think there's a lot, you know, Sylvari from other Pale Trees. There's a lot of possibility here. This would look very good for many X-Packs. I've saved it for last on the list here, but I feel emphatically that this should be done. So there you go. So those are the big feature ideas. Hopefully that's somewhat invigorating to you guys. Now, for this next bit of the video, I want to close it down just discussing another thing that mini X-Packs can do on the feature front that shouldn't be ignored. I kind of imagine mini X-Packs as doing a big feature and then like a smaller thing on the side. So let's talk about this idea of smaller things on the side. What can those be? Well, like reworks and enhancements of established stuff in the game. So there's a moment in the blog post, a bit like where they very sneakily say combat updates, and we don't really know what that means in the context of Elite Specializations. There's a moment as well where they suggest they can go back to old things and update them. And I sort of said at the time, well, how does that really work? Well, I do think that there's space here. I'm talking about updates that would be a big benefit to Guild Wars 2, but they're way too meaty for random small patches. Like, think about World 3 and 4 of the Super Adventure Box. When we're dealing with mini X-Packs and just charging ahead constantly, where they still don't really have space for World 3 and 4 of the Super Adventure Box. Living World Season 1 was a similar type thing, and look at what they had to do. They burned a year, really, re-implementing that. Obviously, also setting up a lot of what we're going to be playing soon. But, you know, there's not really space for anything like that. If they didn't do Living World Season 1 last year, when would they ever have found a way to do it? So, one of the other games I'm a big fan of and follow very closely is Stellaris from Paradox Studios. You might remember I did a series about it on YouTube. And they kind of do mini X-Packs too, but they've got a very cool concept that I think ArenaNet could pay attention to, which is that Paradox essentially realized you don't have to sell everything in their, like, upcoming expansion. What they'll do is they'll look at reworking a core system or something about the core game that's broken and could use improvements. They'll rework it, perk it up. It's kind of a part of the expansion, but technically they didn't sell it with the expansion. It's just that it launched when the expansion launched. And while they're technically not the same thing, by releasing everything all together, everyone's excited and everyone ends up getting the expansion and they all play together. And usually, like, their big core game rework will have a hook into the new box that they're selling. And it creates a ton of hype. So let me give you a very clear idea here. Like, let's look at guild missions, okay? I really believe that guild missions right now desperately need to be looked at. We need they're in a sorry state. They're one of the best ways of keeping groups of people together. A fun thing that people can go together and do every week, particularly for those of us who don't raid or don't strike. You know, we don't feel comfortable in those areas. Guild missions were a great place to have a community and a meaning for a community in Guild Wars, but they're in a sorry state and they have been for years. The priority one is that you need something good to spend that currency on, the guild mission currency, but people are going to want new missions as well. They're going to want a lot of the weird jank and clunk that's, especially like in the PvP and the world versus world missions and stuff, to be ironed out. People like the idea of new puzzles. Well, let's look at mini X-Packs. I think that each mini X-Pack, ArenaNet should look at a system like this, like guild missions, and say, okay, this mini X-Pack, this is the one where we look at guild missions. Guild missions get a bunch of time, a bunch of love, they get the stuff that they need, and while they're at it, maybe there's a couple of new guild missions in the mini X-Pack, but that's the focus this time. And in this way, even though they're spending a bunch of time and resources just fixing core game issues, they can talk about it in expansion press, and it all builds hype for the game, and it all actually continues to fix up and help the game. So I think this is a really good idea. Each mini X-Pack should just look at a different thing from the base game and improve it and maybe give it a little hook. Some things on this list, I would say, like activities. You know, we were talking about Polymock just now as one of those things that could have been in Guild Wars 2 and wasn't. Back in early Guild Wars 2 blog posts, before the game came out, they were talking about a bunch of activities that still aren't in the game. And what about South Sun Survival and all these weird things? Well, maybe these guys just need a bit of a look. They need some rewards put on them that people will actually find a bit more meaningful. They need to be, you know, more evident what daily activity is for the day. People should be able to go to them, and they should get that little bit of a refresh. Dailies themselves as well. I would love an update to the dailies and daily rewards and how that structure works. World versus World is a perfect example here as well. If we talk about the idea of a new Borderlands or new World versus World abilities or extensions to the current World versus World abilities, this is where I think that space for that should exist. Now, they've talked a lot about DirectX 11 and stuff lately, but, you know, there are improvements they might be able to make to the graphics, to the rendering capabilities, to different options we get, UI improvements, all that kind of stuff bundled with X-Packs. One thing that people constantly are talking about, and I really don't actually stand by, but for an example, underwater combat as well. A lot of people say, oh, they really want underwater to be improved. They need to look at underwater. I actually think that's a terrible idea and a non-starter, but it's an example of something well paired with a mini X-Pack. Fractals as well. There's a lot of bloat in fractals that can be removed. There's this idea of, do they lean into the idea of it being a heavy progression game type, i.e. add more tiers, Fractals T5, Fractals T6, Fractals T7 and on, or do they just completely change it? For what it's worth, I think they should lean into it as a progression thing. That's maybe a discussion for another story. But, you know, concepts like integrating the explorable dungeons into Fractals, those kinds of ideas. Personal story improvements, new player experience stuff, fixing up the Zaitan fight. I believe that there's some big YouTuber or streamer that just tried Guild Wars 2 and hated the Zaitan fight. Like 50,000 people saw it was terrible. And, you know, if ArenaNet ever want to fix stuff like that with a new player update, pair it with a mini X pack. And so finally I come back to this idea of other legendaries. Earlier I was talking about like legendaries and new slots. But what about like a golden fractal backpack or an abyssal fractal backpack or new world versus world and PvP backpacks or just any other legendaries, trinkets and stuff like that? I think that adding new legendaries in established slots, that's not that exciting, but is really good to pair with these refreshes. So for example, if they're going to refresh guild missions, pair it with a mini X-Pack, well maybe one of the things that would make guild missions really exciting and something people would like to do is if there's a legendary you can earn through guild missions by collecting enough of the tickets and so on. A mini X-Pack comes out, suddenly people have loads of guild missions that they can do to earn a legendary, they're all getting communities with the mini X-Pack, and away they go, you know, and that works really well up until the next one. So yeah, I think that is the other side of this. I think there's two things. They want to create new features, but they also want to find the space to fix something up with Guild Wars and sort of pair that as a feature too. Hopefully I've articulated that well. That was a bit waffly, to be honest, at the end of the video there. But there you have it. That's my thoughts on features. And that's basically everything I have to say about mini X-Packs now, guys. I've had a lot of comments over the past few days of people saying, oh, it's so good to see you so active, blah, 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 blah. You know, I will be active and I will talk a lot about this game when they give us stuff to talk about this game and when, you know, there's actual meaningful discussion to be had. I think that this was a really huge announcement, so naturally there's a lot I want to run through. These are kind of my thoughts, quite happily as well, by the way. I was fairly cynical when that blog post first came out about various elements, but I think over these past few episodes, I've sort of convinced myself they can do good stuff instead of elite specs if they're going to get rid of them. They can do good stuff for, you know, stories and areas of the world, and I think they can even do good stuff for features for many, many years yet as well. I mean, according to how I feel, this is just what I think should happen with the game and where it should go. They may have very, very different ideas, and we'll see whether they do anything like this. They might not, but I'll be there for videos of that for you guys all as well. So yeah, keep an eye on the channel. I think next I'm going to be looking a lot more at this upcoming patch, and we'll be picking up some of our other projects. Thank you very, very much for watching, guys. If you've got interesting thoughts and comments, let me have those, because I can do some follow-up Q&As. Should be a good time. I mean, as long as people are watching and there's activity, I'm really happy to keep doing it. Thank you, everybody. It's been a great time. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you on the next one.